The bank card slipped from her fingers, hitting the cold marble floor with a dry, final sound. Every head in the grand lobby turned toward her, some curious, others disdainful. Rachel Morgan stood frozen, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never imagined that withdrawing $500 of her own money could become the most humiliating moment of her life. Across the counter, the blonde manager, Victoria Hale, folded her arms, her voice calm but laced with needles. "You understand, don't you? $500 isn't a small amount considering your circumstances." Each word fell like a pin, sharp and deliberate. No one laughed, but the silence in the room was heavy with contempt. Outside the glass walls, Boston's pale light reflected on Rachel's face, tired, confused, and aching. This morning, she had only planned to stop by the bank, withdraw some money for groceries, buy flowers for the dining table, and then visit a small cafe nearby. A simple, peaceful morning until she stepped through those marble doors. The lobby of Commonwealth First Bank felt like another world. Polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers shimmering above, and the faint scent of expensive perfume drifting through the air. The customers were dressed in luxury briefcases, in hand discussing stocks and investment deals. In her cream sweater jeans and worn flats, Rachel suddenly felt out of place, like a misplaced color on a perfect canvas. When she placed her documents on the counter, the young teller frowned at the screen, then quietly disappeared into the back office. Minutes later, Victoria Hale emerged. The woman carried herself as if she owned not only the bank, but the entire street outside. Her golden hair fell in perfect waves, her white suit flawless, and her heels struck the marble floor with the confidence of someone born to superiority. Each step widened the distance between their worlds. "How much are you trying to withdraw $500 from my personal account?" Victoria smiled, a blade hidden behind the curve of her lips. "I'll need to verify a few things. There are some irregularities with your account." The room seemed to tighten. A few customers glanced over, whispering. Rachel felt her breath grow heavier. "I don't understand. I just need the money for household shopping. Then perhaps you can provide proof of income or documentation showing the source of funds. For just $500? Victoria shrugged her voice. "Sugar sweet, but poisoned. We have to protect the bank from fraud, you understand." From across the lobby, a security guard began walking toward them, his expression alert. Rachel's face burned, her heart pounding. The air felt dense, each breath cutting against her throat. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I have my card and my ID. This is my money." But her voice was small against the wall of suspicion around her. Victoria tilted her head and spoke clearly, making sure the entire lobby could hear. "You're disrupting the bank's operations. If you can't provide verification, I'll have to ask you to leave." Then she turned to the guard. "Escort her out." In that moment, Rachel couldn't speak. She only heard the sound of shoes striking marble, the soft click of doors opening, and the whispers behind her, small sounds that pierced her dignity like glass. Outside, the cold wind swept through spinning yellow leaves around her feet. She stood in front of the marble building, hands trembling as she held her phone. The screen blurred with tears. Ethan Morgan, her husband, was probably in an important meeting. She wanted to call him, to hear his voice telling her everything would be fine. But the call rang once, then stopped. Amid the rush of people on Beacon Street, Rachel stood still. No one stopped to ask. No one looked twice. A woman thrown out of a bank, just another forgettable scene. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Don't cry," she whispered to herself. "Not for them." Then came a sound, low, smooth, powerful. The hum of an engine as a luxury car pulled up to the curb. Rachel turned her head. A silver Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a stop, slicing through the cold morning air. And at that very moment, as the car door opened, Her eyes met the man stepping out, tall, composed in a gray suit, his gaze sharp as steel, Ethan Morgan. The wind still blew, but it no longer felt cold, because she knew from that instant nothing would ever be the same again. When Ethan Morgan stepped out of the Rolls-Royce, the air around him seemed to shift. The flow of people on Beacon Street slowed. A few turned their heads, not because of the luxury car, but because of the presence he carried, calm, powerful, and holding back a storm that simmered beneath the surface. Rachel stood there, still shaken, clutching her phone, her eyes red from tears. When their eyes met for a moment, Boston seemed to fall silent. He reached her in 3 long strides, his hand resting on her shoulder, his voice low and steady but firm. "Rachel, what happened?" She struggled to speak, her voice trembling. "They said I was suspicious. I only tried to withdraw $500, and they threw me out. In front of everyone." Ethan's face darkened, his jaw tightening as his gaze lifted to the white stone building towering above them, the words, "Commonwealth First Bank," gleaming against the gray sky. Who did this? The manager, Victoria Hale. He nodded, his eyes cold as steel. "All right, then we'll speak with her." "Ethan, don't," Rachel pleaded, panic rising in her voice. "I don't want trouble." He looked at her, and for a brief second his expression softened. "You're not the one causing trouble, but someone needs to learn what respect means." Ethan took her hand, warm and steady, and a quiet strength flowed from him into her. Before she could protest again, he had already pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sound of his shoes striking the marble floor echoed through the hall, firm and deliberate. Every head turned toward them. Only minutes ago, Rachel had been treated like a suspect. Now, walking beside this man, the entire atmosphere of the bank changed, as if an invisible wave rippled through the room, straightening everyone's posture. Ethan strode directly to the counter where the same young teller was standing. She froze for a second, her voice quivering. Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" "Call your manager." Ethan said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. From the office in the back, Victoria Hale appeared. At first, her face still bore its usual air of authority, until her eyes landed on the man standing in the center of the lobby. The color drained from her face. Mr. Morgan." Her voice nearly broke. Ethan didn't smile or nod. He simply spoke each word, measured and clear. "You're the one who threw my wife out of your bank, aren't you?" A ripple of whispers spread through the lobby. The name Morgan was far from unfamiliar in Boston's financial world. Morgan Holdings, one of the leading investment groups in the Northeast, controlled dozens of subsidiaries and financial funds. One decision from Ethan could shake this entire bank to its core. Victoria tried to compose herself, her voice trembling but still clinging to professionalism. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Her account showed a few irregular transactions, so I needed to verify them. It was just standard procedure." Ethan tilted his head slightly, a faint trace of irony in his eyes. "Irregular. In an account that I personally funded under my company's name." The air thickened. The teller lowered her gaze to the floor, and the customers held their breath. Victoria's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ethan took a step forward, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "You don't need excuses. You humiliated a customer because of how she looked. You saw a modestly dressed woman and assumed she didn't have money in her account. That's not procedure, that's prejudice." Rachel stood beside her husband, her heart pounding. In the shimmer of the crystal lights, she saw her reflection, small, fragile, yet safe within the calm circle of strength Ethan created amid the storm of stares. Victoria stammered, I didn't know she was your wife." Ethan cut her off, his tone turning colder. "And if you had known, you wouldn't have done it. So only people with power deserve respect." No one dared to speak. Even the sound of keyboards had stopped. Ethan turned to Rachel, his hand closing around hers. "You don't have to explain anything. We're done here." Then he faced Victoria, his voice steady and final. "I'm closing every account, corporate and personal. That includes the payroll accounts for 10,000 employees. Effective today." Victoria staggered, her lips parting in disbelief. "Sir, please wait." But Ethan had already turned away, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "Learn to treat people with dignity before your bank learns its lesson through numbers." As the couple walked out, every gaze followed them. Rachel could hear her heartbeat sync with the sound of Ethan's steps, strong, unwavering. Outside, the dim midday light glinted on his hair, reflecting off the white stone beneath their feet. And within her, beneath the anger and the shame of what had happened, one feeling rose above all pride. Not because her husband was wealthy, but because he had stood up not just for her, but for what was right. Behind them, the doors of the bank closed. Ahead of them, a story about dignity and justice had only just begun. The sound of the glass doors closing behind them echoed like the signal of an oncoming storm. Ethan stopped in the center of the marble lobby, his polished leather shoes reflecting off the gleaming floor, the chandelier light catching the sharp lines of his face. Rachel stood beside him, still trembling from the humiliation she had just endured, but this time the fear was slowly giving way to something else, a fragile sense of faith being rebuilt. Across the room, Victoria Hale was struggling to conceal her panic. The face that had once been perfectly composed now betrayed clear traces of tension. Her lips pressed together, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape in the thick, suffocating air. The authority she had worn like armor was gone, replaced by discomfort and fear. "Mr. Morgan," she began, her voice trembling as she tried to sound composed. "Please understand. I was simply following standard procedures to protect the bank from fraudulent activity." If I had known, Ethan cut her off, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "If you had known she was my wife, you wouldn't have done it right. You would have smiled, said, 'Good morning, Mrs. Morgan,' offered her a seat in the VIP lounge, brought her a drink." "Isn't that right, Mrs. Hale?" Victoria stammered. "I didn't mean to offend. Didn't mean to offend." Ethan let out a quiet laugh, one entirely devoid of humor. "You looked at an ordinary woman and decided she wasn't worth respect. You saw jeans, a worn handbag, and assumed she didn't belong here. That's not procedure, Mrs. Hale. That's prejudice." The air in the bank seemed to freeze. Several customers pretended to check their phones, but it was clear they were listening to every word. One young employee lowered her head, shame flickering in her eyes. Rachel's heart tightened, part pain, part awe. She had never seen her husband like this before. Ethan was usually calm, gentle, measured in everything he said. But now he spoke with the voice of a man who knew power intimately and was using it to defend the woman he loved. Victoria forced out a strained smile. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding, Mr. Morgan. If I had known—" "You still don't understand." Ethan interrupted, his voice, dropping each word, landing like a hammer on stone. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who she was. The problem is that you don't know who you are. A bank manager cannot lead through arrogance. You've forgotten the most basic principle of this business: respect." He turned his head, raising his voice so it carried through the marble hall. "And I want every employee here to hear this clearly. From this moment on, Morgan Holdings is terminating all business with Commonwealth First Bank. Every corporate account, every investment fund, every personal account closed effective immediately." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Customers exchanged stunned glances while the tellers behind the counter turned pale. The name Morgan Holdings hit like a bomb. Anyone in Boston's financial world knew what that meant. Losing that client would cripple the branch. Victoria's face turned ashen, her hands trembling. Mr. Morgan, please wait. Perhaps we can discuss this privately in my office. Ethan didn't look back. You humiliated my wife publicly, so your apology should be public too. He turned to Rachel, taking her hand, his gaze softening for a moment. His voice, low and warm, seemed meant only for her. You don't have to say anything. Today they saw the truth, not about how much you were trying to withdraw, but about how wrong they were to judge you. Then he faced Victoria again, his tone once more cold and sharp. Tell me, Mrs. Hale, if my wife had come in dressed like a socialite driving a luxury car wearing diamonds, would you have dared to treat her this way? No one spoke. Only silence answered the silence of shame. Ethan stepped closer. We're not just withdrawing our money, we're withdrawing our trust. And once that's gone, you'll realize nothing in this bank can buy it back. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Her face flushed red as she gripped the counter to steady herself. Please, sir. I truly regret what happened. Ethan looked at her one last time. I believe you. But regret doesn't restore the dignity you took away. He turned to Rachel. Let's go. Together they walked across the lobby as every pair of eyes followed them. This time, no one dared look away. A few employees lowered their heads. An older man near the exit gave a small nod, a silent gesture of respect. As Rachel held Ethan's hand and stepped through the doors, she heard his voice behind her, calm and resonant. Mrs. Hale, just so you know, my wife could have withdrawn $50,000 today if she wanted to, and that account still holds enough to buy this entire branch. The doors closed. For a long moment, the bank was silent. Outside, the breeze drifted down Beacon Street, carrying with it the echo of a costly lesson one no witness would ever forget. For Rachel, it was more than justice restored. It was the moment she realized that dignity is never granted by others, it belongs to those who have the courage to hold on to it. Autumn light spread across Beacon Street, glinting off the silver Rolls-Royce parked by the curb. As the bank doors closed behind them, Rachel stood still. The faint murmurs from inside still carried through the glass, but to her, it all seemed distant now. All she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat and the warmth of Ethan's hand clasping hers. She drew in a deep breath, the breeze mingling with the scent of coffee from the cafe across the street, and realized her shoulders were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from release. The humiliation, the anger, the looks of contempt, the words, suspicious transaction, all of it had been wiped away by a few calm, resolute sentences from the man standing beside her. Ethan opened the car door, his voice low but gentle. Are you all right? Rachel nodded faintly, her lips trembling. I didn't expect it to end like this. He looked at her, his gaze filled with both tenderness and pride. Neither did I. But what matters is, you didn't bow your head. She let out a small laugh, fragile but sincere through the shimmer of her tears. Honestly, I just tried to stand tall, because if I had fallen, they would have won. Ethan tilted his head, studying her for a moment before speaking softly. No, Rachel. They never stood a chance. Because the moment you walked out of that bank with your head held high, you were already stronger than them. He started the engine, the low hum blending into the rhythm of the busy street. Through the window, the bank building grew smaller, its reflection fading in the rearview mirror. I'll make sure they understand what loss really means. Ethan said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Not because of money, but because of how they treated another human being. Rachel stayed quiet. She didn't need any more promises. One look into his eyes was enough to know he wasn't speaking out of pride, but out of justice. That afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe by the Charles River, where golden sunlight shimmered on the water's surface. Rachel looked down at her hands resting on the table, her fingers still trembling slightly. Ethan ordered 2 cappuccinos and a bouquet of fresh sunflowers from the counter. Do you remember the first time we met? He asked, his tone carrying a trace of nostalgia. Of course she smiled. It was in a cramped coffee shop. You spilled coffee all over my notebook, and you scolded me for 3 whole minutes because you were laughing while I was angry. They both laughed, their laughter mingling with the gentle ripple of the river, washing away the heaviness of the morning. Ethan gazed out over the water and spoke quietly. I never want you to feel belittled again. The world already has enough people who think they have the right to measure others by their worth. Rachel replied softly, but there are also people who remind us that dignity still matters. People like you. Her words made Ethan reach across the table and take her hand. In the middle of the bustling city, beneath the soft warmth of the afternoon sun, the two of them seemed to exist in a quiet world of their own. Everything that had once made Rachel feel small had disappeared. Later that evening, when they returned to their lakeside home, Rachel placed the bouquet of sunflowers on the dining table, the same flowers she had planned to buy that morning with the $500. She looked at them and smiled, not because of their price, but because of what they symbolized: faith and quiet strength. She opened a drawer and took out the crumpled withdrawal slip the bank had never processed. The small piece of paper, though worn and insignificant, carried an entire lesson. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her notebook. I'm keeping it, she said as Ethan stepped behind her, to remind myself that sometimes respect begins with how we face contempt. Ethan smiled and rested his hand on her shoulder. And to remember that a person's true strength lies in protecting dignity, their own and that of others. Outside, the sunset stretched its golden light across the lake. Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder. The humiliation of the morning had transformed into something entirely different, a quiet awakening. One day, one denied withdrawal, one woman underestimated it, seemed like nothing. Yet it was enough to remind the world that dignity cannot be bought with money, and respect is not a privilege, but a duty. 3 months later, on a cold winter morning, when Boston was wrapped in a thin veil of mist, like the breath of the season itself, Rachel opened the mailbox outside her porch. Among the bills and meaningless advertisements, she saw a cream-colored envelope with no logo, only 2 handwritten words, to Mrs. Rachel Morgan. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, steady, but trembling just enough to reveal hesitation. Something in her gut told her to sit right there on the steps and open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the scent of fresh ink still lingering. The name at the top made her freeze. Victoria Hale. Dear Mrs. Morgan, I write this letter not as a bank manager, but as a human being who has just learned the most expensive lesson of her life. Rachel read slowly, each word carrying its own weight. Victoria explained that since that day, news had spread throughout the banking network. The board launched an internal investigation, and she was demoted, reassigned to a small suburban branch. But what broke her spirit wasn't the loss of her position. It was the moment she saw her own reflection in the glass doors of the bank that morning, arrogant, cold, and indifferent. I realized that in my effort to uphold procedure, I had lost something far more important: compassion. When Mr. Morgan said, "You've forgotten who you really are," I couldn't sleep for many nights. He was right. I didn't just humiliate you. I humiliated the very profession I once took pride in. At that line, Rachel's hands trembled slightly. The cold wind swept across the porch, shaking the bare branches overhead. She remembered Victoria's eyes that day, sharp and cold as a blade. She never imagined the same woman who had driven her to tears in that marble lobby could write something so sincere. I've made a public apology in front of all the staff. I taught them a lesson about seeing people not through clothes or wallets, but through eyes and actions. I know I can't erase that painful memory for you, but I want you to know that because of you, I've changed. Rachel folded the letter and held it in her hands for a long time. What she felt was mixed, not anger, not even forgiveness, but a quiet peace. Because in a world so full of prejudice, it was rare to find someone brave enough to admit they were wrong. She placed the envelope on the dining table where pale sunlight filtered through the window, falling across the dried sunflowers. The same flowers she had planned to buy that morning. They were wilted now, yet their yellow still glowed warm. That afternoon, Ethan came home earlier than usual. He took off his heavy coat, set his folder down on the table, and noticed the cream-colored envelope. "What's this?" "A letter from Victoria Hale." Rachel said softly. He frowned, but she raised her hand gently. "No, not what you think," she apologized. Ethan said nothing, then pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The late afternoon light cast a soft gold hue on his face. "Are you going to respond?" Rachel shook her head. "No. Some apologies don't need a reply, because their purpose isn't to be forgiven, but to remind the writer of what they did wrong." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You're right. Still, I can't help feeling sorry for her. She lost her position, her reputation, all because she didn't know how to show respect." Rachel smiled gently. "No, Ethan. She didn't lose everything. At least she found herself again." That night after dinner, Rachel placed the letter in her desk drawer. Inside it now rested two things: the unprocessed withdrawal receipt and the apology letter. Two pieces of paper, one a witness to humiliation, the other proof of change, lying side by side like two halves of the same lesson. She wrote a small note on a sticky paper and placed it on the drawer. "Respect isn't given. It's reflected." Then she turned off the light and stepped onto the balcony. The city of Boston glowed in the distance. Inside her, every storm had passed, and in the chill of early winter, she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the greatest changes are born from the smallest wounds. Her story didn't end with revenge, but with awakening for two women, two worlds, and one enduring truth: dignity. That winter came early to Boston. The wind swept down Beacon Street, whipping bare branches against windows, leaving behind the faint tapping sound of time itself, reminding everyone that another year was drawing to a close. In the lakeside house, Rachel Morgan sat by the fireplace, holding a cup of hot cocoa, her eyes following the flickering flames as they reflected on the cream-colored letter resting in her lap. 3 months had passed since the day she was humiliated at the bank, and life seemed to have returned to its quiet rhythm. But peace didn't mean forgetting. The wound on her pride no longer hurt, yet it had left a faint trace, like a crack on a glass that still gleamed under the light. It made her more careful, more thoughtful, and in many ways stronger than ever. Ethan stepped out from his study phone still in hand. He sat beside her, his expression softening when he saw her lost in thought. Reading her letter again, Rachel folded the paper and smiled faintly. "Not exactly. I was just thinking if that day hadn't happened, maybe I'd never have really understood who I am." Ethan leaned back, his voice deep and steady. "All I see is that they hurt you, but they also made you shine. You're not afraid of people's judgment anymore." Rachel looked at him, a quiet smile crossing her face. "You're right. I used to think respect was something others gave you, but it turns out it starts with how you treat yourself." A few days later, Ethan was invited to speak at an annual financial conference in New York. He wanted Rachel to come with him. "Not for appearances," he said, "but because I want them to see the woman who made me believe that true power doesn't come from money." That evening, inside the grand hall of the hotel where the conference was held, Rachel appeared in a simple black dress. Her hair was softly curled, her eyes clear and calm. She needed no designer labels, no spotlight, only the quiet confidence that made the room pause when she walked in. A female bank executive familiar with Ethan approached with a handshake and a polite smile. Mr. Morgan, what an honor! I heard your firm withdrew all accounts from Commonwealth First. Rumor says it was because of an issue with a client. Ethan smiled, slightly glancing at his wife. Not a client. A wife they underestimated. The woman froze for a brief second, then lowered her head. Rachel said nothing, only smiled the kind of smile free from resentment, carrying the peace of someone who had already healed. When they returned home after the conference, Rachel opened her laptop and began to write a short piece for a women's magazine she admired. She didn't use her real name, only signed it R.M. The article was titled, "The Day They Judged Me." She recounted her experience not to complain or seek pity, but to remind readers that dignity doesn't depend on social status. It depends on how we respond to injustice. The piece was published that weekend and spread faster than she expected. Thousands of comments poured in women who had been belittled because of their appearance, men who had witnessed unfairness but hadn't known how to speak up. One message read, "Your story reminded me of when a hotel clerk scolded me just because I wore a janitor's uniform. Thank you for saying what so many of us never could." Rachel read every line, her eyes shimmering. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "See, sometimes you don't need power to change the world, just one honest story." One snowy morning in early January, Rachel received a short email from an unfamiliar address. "I read your article. I saw myself in every word. Thank you for telling it, not with hatred, but with grace. VH." Rachel smiled. She didn't need to ask to know who it was, Victoria Hale. She closed her laptop and looked out the window. The lake was covered in snow, the faint light turning everything into a painting. Deep down, she understood some battles don't need noise or weapons, only someone brave enough to stand tall amid prejudice. Outside, Ethan called from the hallway. "Are you ready? We've got an appointment at the gallery today." Rachel turned, her face lighting up. "Let's go. You know, I think I'll paint that morning at the bank. But this time the ending will be different. The woman in the painting will be smiling." Ethan laughed as he handed her coat to her. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and white, washing away what was old. And in Rachel Morgan's heart that winter became a season of forgiveness, awakening, and dignity. One morning in mid-February, as the last traces of snow melted along the eaves, Rachel's small studio was filled with sunlight. The painting she had been working on for 3 weeks was nearly complete, a familiar scene of Commonwealth First Bank, but told from an entirely different perspective. The woman in the painting wore a cream-colored sweater, standing alone in the gleaming marble lobby. Around her were cold, indifferent faces, yet beyond the glass doors, a single ray of golden light pierced through, falling across her face, not the light of humiliation, but of freedom. Rachel titled the piece, "The Day I Stood Still." She never intended to exhibit it anywhere. The painting was her way of confronting the memory, turning pain into something she could touch and move past. But fate, as always, had a way of carrying private things far beyond their intended reach. One afternoon, when Rachel brought the painting to a small frame shop on Hanover Street, the shop owner, a middle-aged woman named Lydia Carmichael, studied it for a long time. "You painted this from real emotion, didn't you?" she asked, her eyes lingering on the woman standing alone in the crowd. Rachel smiled. "Yes. Sometimes silence is the only way to stay standing." Lydia gently touched the edge of the frame. "I'm organizing a small exhibit called Resilience: The Strength of Stillness at the end of the month. I'd like to display this piece. Would you allow it?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded softly. "If you think it might reach someone, then yes." On the day of the exhibition, the small gallery in North End was filled to capacity. Among the vibrant, colorful artworks, Rachel's painting stood quietly in the brightest corner, simple, calm, yet commanding attention in its own quiet way. Beneath it, Lydia had placed a small placard that read, No one knows how strong they are until they are forced to rise for their own dignity. R.M. Visitors lingered before the painting. A young waitress in uniform wiped away tears. An older man nodded slowly, murmuring, "I see my wife in that." Rachel stood in the corner silently watching. Each gaze that paused before the painting reminded her her pain had never been hers alone. Everyone had been judged, underestimated, forced at some point to choose between silence and standing tall. Amid the crowd, she spotted Ethan entering, his hands in his pockets, his tall frame composed as always. He stopped in front of the painting, said nothing, just stared for a long moment. Then he turned and smiled at her, a small nod that told Rachel he understood. This painting wasn't just a memory, it was a release. That night after the exhibit ended, Rachel's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Mrs. Morgan, it's me, Victoria Hale." Rachel froze for a second, her heart beating faster. "I'm listening." The woman's voice was no longer sharp or proud, but trembling sincere. "I read the article about the exhibition. I saw the painting. I knew it was your story, and I just wanted to say thank you for not turning me into the villain in your memory." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't need anyone to be the villain, Mrs. Hale. I just need to remember that everyone has a choice to tear others down or to learn to respect them." "I understand," Victoria said softly. "I made the wrong choice. But now I'm trying to make it right. I've started volunteering with a financial program that helps single mothers start businesses. Maybe that's how I make peace with what I did." Neither of them spoke much after that. Just a few seconds of silence, but in that silence, forgiveness found its place. When the call ended, Rachel stood by the window watching snow fall gently across the yard. The city lights glowed against the white, creating a soft, dreamlike shimmer. The following month, Lydia sent Rachel a card. "The painting The Day I Stood Still has been selected by an art gallery in Chicago for their upcoming series, Women of Dignity. They'd like you to speak at the opening." Rachel read the note and smiled. She hadn't painted for recognition, but if her story could travel farther and touch more hearts, that was the most beautiful reward she could ask for. That evening, Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, his voice low and warm. "I told you one day they'd see what I've always seen in you, the strength within calm." She turned to face him, meeting his eyes, and said softly, "It's not strength, Ethan. It's dignity. It doesn't shout, but no one can ever take it away." He smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Outside, the night wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint chimes from the harbor. Inside, the small lamp cast its light on the painting hanging on the wall. The woman in the cream sweater still standing quietly, the golden light still shining through the window. But now, as Rachel looked at it, she saw something different. The woman was no longer alone. She had turned pain into light, judgment into art, and a day of humiliation into a symbol of pride. Her story was no longer the day they judged me. It was the day she chose to stand tall and never bow again. March. On the flight to Chicago, the eastern sky burned with a streak of orange light like fire spreading through the clouds. Rachel sat by the window, her hands clasped together, feeling a strange yet peaceful calm within her. She was no longer the woman who had been thrown out of a bank for trying to withdraw $500. She was on her way to a new city, invited as an artist to speak at the Women of Dignity exhibition. Ethan turned to her and smiled. "This time, you don't need me by your side, do you?" Rachel smiled back. "You just have to sit in the front row. I can speak for myself." "I know," he said. "But let me tell you one thing before you walk on that stage." "What is it?" "You're not sharing your story for pity, Rachel. You're sharing it to remind people that respect isn't a gift. It's something every person deserves." She nodded, and in that moment, every trace of nervousness disappeared. The opening of the exhibition took place in a grand old art space along the Chicago River. Golden light streamed through the tall windows, reflecting on dozens of paintings by female artists from around the world. Each canvas told a story, a journey of strength, faith, and quiet pride. At the center of the main hall, Rachel's "The Day I Stood Still" hung against a white wall displayed with quiet reverence. Below the frame, a small plaque read, "For everyone who has ever been misjudged, stand tall, because your dignity does not need validation." Rachel stood near her painting, listening to the sounds of footsteps, murmurs, and camera shutters clicking in the background. A young journalist approached her and asked Ms. Morgan, "What made you choose to paint such a painful moment in your life?" Rachel tilted her head slightly, her smile calm, but her gaze steady. "Because sometimes we only discover who we truly are when we're forced to stand in the storm. And I wanted to capture that moment, not when I was diminished, but when I chose to stand tall." Her answer was brief, but it silenced the room for a few seconds. The cameras flashed. A middle-aged woman nearby reached out to touch the edge of the frame, tears streaming down her face. After the interviews, Rachel was invited to the stage. She walked slowly, her heels tapping softly against the wooden floor, each step echoing just enough to fill the hall. Under the spotlight, her face seemed to glow not from makeup, but from the quiet strength that had become her power. 3 years ago, she began, "I was just an ordinary woman, walking into a bank to withdraw a little money for groceries. But I walked out with a broken heart. They didn't see me as a person. They saw an old sweater, worn shoes, and decided I wasn't worthy of trust." Her voice was low, deliberate, every word cutting through the silence. "That day, I cried. But I also learned something invaluable. No one can make you small unless you let them." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the audience. In the front row, Ethan met her gaze and nodded, his look filled with pride, a quiet encouragement without words. "I didn't paint to relive the pain," she continued. "I painted to remind myself that even in moments of humiliation, we still have the choice to stand still and hold on to our dignity. And sometimes that calmness is the most powerful form of resistance." When she finished, the entire room rose in applause. It wasn't loud, but it was long clapping that came from shared understanding, from empathy, from respect for a story that felt deeply human. That night, after everyone had left, Rachel stayed behind in the gallery. She stood before her painting, the soft light casting shadows over the woman in the cream sweater. In the stillness, she whispered, "Thank you for not falling." Ethan entered, draping a coat over her shoulders. "I've got a message for you," he said, handing her his phone. On the screen was an email from an unfamiliar address. "I watched your speech tonight. Thank you for telling that story with grace, not anger. It made me believe that I still have a chance to be better. VH." Rachel pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening. "She's still following you," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe that painting didn't just save you. Maybe it saved her too." Rachel nodded. Because art, like forgiveness, has the power to heal. The next day, as they left Chicago, Rachel looked out the car window one last time. The gallery faded behind the bare winter trees, but inside her the light remained. She once believed justice came when someone paid the price. But now she understood true justice is when your heart no longer carries the weight of resentment. On the drive to the airport, Ethan took her hand and said softly, "You know that day when I saw you standing in the middle of that bank? I thought this woman doesn't need anyone to protect her. She just needs to be seen." Rachel turned to him, smiling. "And in the end, the world did see me, not because I changed, but because I refused to stop being myself." The car moved on spring sunlight filtering through the window, falling gently across their intertwined hands. Behind them, the billboard for the Women of Dignity exhibition still glowed brightly with a small line beneath it that read, "Dignity isn't something we search for. It's how we stand tall when the world tries to make us kneel." And Rachel Morgan smiled, knowing her journey was far from over. It had only just begun on the day she chose to stand tall. That spring arrived softly like a breath. The bitter winds of Boston had faded, replaced by the faint scent of apple blossoms drifting along the lakeside. In the small house by the water, Rachel Morgan stood at the open window, watching the morning light spread across the lake like a ribbon of gold. 3 months had passed since the exhibition in Chicago, yet its echoes still lingered. Her paintings had spread across social media, not because of fame, but because of their message. "The Day I Stood Still" had been shared thousands of times under the hashtag #WomenOfDignity. Beneath it, people wrote their own stories. A waitress looked down upon by a customer, a single mother dismissed as unworthy, a young woman turned away from a job because of her modest appearance. Rachel read every word, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never imagined that a painting born from her own pain could help others rediscover hope. One message read, "I cried when I saw the light in your painting. It felt like the hope I thought I had lost." One morning, she received a call from a local radio station inviting her to appear on a program called Stories That Change Us. At first, Rachel declined. She didn't want to be a public figure, just a storyteller, but Ethan gently encouraged her. "You're not telling your story to be recognized," he said. "You're telling it to spread what's right." In the small recording studio beneath the silver microphone that gleamed under the lights, Rachel shared her story in a calm, steady voice, without dramatization, without bitterness. It was the voice of someone who had once been diminished but had chosen to rise with quiet strength. "What changed me," she said slowly, "was not when they apologized, but when I stopped letting anger define me. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward without carrying the weight." The program aired on Friday morning. By noon, the station's inbox was flooded with messages. Among them was one that the editor forwarded to Rachel, a letter from Victoria Hale. "Rachel, I listened to your broadcast this morning. Your voice is as calm as the first time we met. I just wanted to tell you that I'm living a different life now, simpler, but more genuine. I've started teaching free finance classes for single women, and every time I begin, I share your story. They ask me why I would tell a story that once shamed me. I tell them it's because it reminds me that I was wrong and that I was forgiven." Rachel pressed her hand to her chest, warmth spreading through her like a small flame lit within. In that moment, she understood that forgiveness can be more powerful than any punishment. That night, Ethan came home late. He found Rachel in the living room writing something in her small notebook. "New notes for your next painting?" he asked. She nodded softly. "I want to paint again, but this time not about pain, about light. The painting will be called After the Storm." Ethan smiled, sitting down beside her. "You know, I think every story should end in light. The storm is only there to test whether we're brave enough to walk out of it." Rachel looked at him, her gentle smile glowing. "You are my light, Ethan, but what makes me happiest is realizing that I can also light my own way." The next morning, Rachel began sketching her new painting. The sky was radiant, the ground still wet from rain reflecting golden light. At the center stood the woman in the cream sweater again, but this time she was surrounded by blooming sunflowers, the same flowers she had meant to buy on that humiliating morning at the bank. She brushed each stroke carefully, her expression serene and focused. From the next room came Ethan's voice, cheerful and warm. "Morning coffee's ready." Rachel laughed softly. His voice, the smell of coffee, the sound of her brush against the canvas, all blended into a tender melody of quiet joy. When she finished the final stroke, Rachel stepped back to look at her work. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the canvas as she whispered, "No one can take away our dignity if we know how to keep the light within." Her new painting, like herself, was no longer about pain. It was about rebirth. One late afternoon, the lake in front of Rachel's house reflected the golden glow of the sunset. The sunflowers in the glass vase tilted gently toward the light, shining as brightly as the name of her new painting. The studio was quiet, filled only with the soft whisper of the wind brushing through the curtains and the gentle sound of a paintbrush touching canvas. Rachel sat there, her face calm and serene. On the easel. After the storm was complete, a painting of rebirth. The woman in the cream sweater now stood in the middle of a vast field of flowers, her hair lifted softly by the breeze bathed in light. There were no more judging eyes around her, no cold stares or harsh words. Only freedom and light remained. Ethan walked in holding 2 cups of hot tea. He stopped behind her, gazing at the painting for a long moment before speaking. "I like this version better," he said. "She's no longer being seen through anyone else's eyes." Rachel smiled. "That's because she no longer needs anyone to see her. She finally sees herself." They sat by the window together. Outside, a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and the distant song of late birds. Rachel rested her hand on the table, her voice soft as a breath. "I used to think that day at the bank was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but it turned out to be a gift. Without that moment, I might still be living in a small world, believing that respect was something given by others." Ethan took her hand, his eyes filled with quiet conviction. "You turned a wound into a path for others to walk on. I think that's the true meaning of strength." Rachel looked out over the lake, the surface shimmering with light. For a moment, she saw her reflection, not the woman who once bowed her head in that marble lobby, but someone who could stand in the wind, calm and free. "The storm never really goes away," she whispered. "We just learn how to walk through the rain without losing our light." Ethan smiled. "And you are that light." Outside, the sunset faded, giving way to the first stars of the evening. In the small lakeside studio, Rachel Morgan closed her sketchbook and wrote one final line on the page: "Dignity doesn't need to be given, only kept." And for her, that was enough. One story had ended, but the light would remain forever. Rachel Morgan's story didn't end with revenge, but with the light of self-respect and forgiveness. From a morning when she was looked down upon in a bank, she transformed pain into strength and turned silence into a voice for thousands who had once been misjudged. If you believe that dignity isn't defined by what we have but by how we rise when we are brought low, leave a like to help spread this story. Share in the comments what you took away from it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next inspiring journeys where every wound has the power to become a guiding light.